Oh, stop. Um, it was the fall of 1994, and I was taking my favorite class that I ever took in high school. The name of the class was High School Basketball Officiating. It was amazing. Our teacher for the class was Coach May. And Coach May embodied about every stereotype that is possible to be embodied in a high school basketball coach. He even had those really tight elastic shorts that every coach seemed to have in those days. I don't know what Coach May's faith was, but I do know what his religion was. His religion was Indiana basketball, and Bobby Knight was his pope. Mr. May was concerned about one and only one thing, that the game of basketball be played properly. And for it not to be played properly was to commit a grave sin. And so what we did every day in that class was we played basketball and learned how to properly officiate a game. There were two things that were required for this class. There was, first of all, an official rule book for the Indiana High School Basketball Association, the platonic form of high school basketball. That was our Bible. And then we also had to purchase a Fox 40 whistle. Patented 3-chamber P-list design, the official and only whistle capable of officiating Indiana high school basketball. Just listen to the glorious sound coming from that thing. The rule book was our Bible. This was our exegesis. For freshmen, that means the interpretation. Okay. There you go. It's important to have a good referee for a basketball game. Without a referee, a game can become chaos very quickly. Everyone just out there calling their own fouls. There's always that one guy who's trying to call charges and 10-second violations. If you're that guy, just know that you're no fun and no one likes you. Having a referee is important. The only thing worse than not having a referee, I think, is having a bad referee. Someone that doesn't know the rules, or someone that doesn't fairly apply the rules, or perhaps someone who's more interested in talking to his girlfriend than officiating the faculty intramural basketball game. I don't know. You know who you are. Or maybe I know who you are. Having a good referee is important. Having someone to blow the whistle and call out of bounds, call for violations. Having a referee is important. Someone has to be the voice. Someone has to be the whistle of authority on the court. So here's my question. My question is, who gets to blow the whistle in your life? Who's your referee? Make no mistake, everyone has a referee. There are no exceptions. Everyone has some authority that they've given the whistle to. I know some people, quite a few people, who've given the whistle to science or human reason. Bill Nye is one of those people. He said that science provides a much more satisfactory way to seek answers than does any religion. For him, science, reason, is the absolute authority, the referee in his life. Now listen, science and reason, these are great. They're gifts of God. But they make much better servants than masters. Giving the whistle to science is sort of like saying that the only genre of music that even exists is country music. Now listen, I love country music, and if you don't like country music, I'll pray for you, okay? But imagine how much would be missing if we only had one genre of music to listen to. I know other people, a lot of people in fact, who've given the whistle to the mob. Now it takes a lot of different forms. Sometimes it's the nameless advertisers who get to blow the whistle telling us what we should buy, what we should not buy, what's right, what's wrong. Sometimes we give the whistle to the advertisers. Sometimes it's the online mob dispensing their approval or disapproval in the form of likes or comments because we care so very much about the opinion of strangers. Sometimes the mob is that hard to define thing that we call public opinion. Whatever's popular, whatever's conventional, whatever is approved, sanctioned, and safe, that gets the authority to blow the whistle in my life. A version of this is found in celebrity culture. We're so desperate for someone to bring order to our lives. We're so desperate for someone to blow the whistle that we will grant authority to celebrities to tell us what's right, to tell us what's wrong, to tell us how we should live our life, even though they have no credentials or qualifications to do so other than the fact that they happen to be famous. Other people, like the Pharisees in the text that I'm going to read today, other people give their whistle over to tradition. Even in the face of an undeniable miracle, authority is given over to tradition. Now listen, I love tradition. Tradition can help us to see our lives with a deeper perspective. But granting all authority to tradition actually obscures our vision and leaves us blind. But let's face it. A lot of us have really just decided we're going to call our own fouls. We're going to keep the whistle for ourselves. We are the final authority. If it seems good to us, it is good. If it seems bad to us, it is bad. We hold the whistle. And of course, when everyone decides to keep the whistle for themselves, when everyone decides that we have no obligation to anyone other than ourselves, chaos and conflict are going to be the natural result of that. It's one of the most important questions that a person can ask. One of the most important questions, I'm not going to blow it again, Josephine. One of the most important questions that a person can ask is simply this: who gets to hold the whistle? Who is the authority in my life? Who is the authority in this world? In John chapter 9, we read the account of Jesus healing a man who had been born blind. And the text begins this way: as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now the disciples here, they're doing two things. They're doing two things that frankly a lot of us are guilty of. The first thing that they do is they turn this blind man into an abstraction. They talk around him, they talk about him as if he were little more than an interesting theological dilemma, and in the process, they strip him of his humanity. But the second thing that they do is the question that they ask reveals our very human tendency to want to understand and thus to control the circumstances of our world. Suffering, you see, is a lot easier to stomach. Blindness is a lot easier to tolerate when we can assign blame. And so Jesus responds to them in the way that is typical of Jesus. He rejects their entire premise. And here's what Jesus says: "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," Jesus said. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. And so the man went and washed and came home seeing. John chapter 9 is really a case study of what Jesus had taught in the previous two chapters, chapters 7 and 8. And understanding this context is really important for understanding the message of this healing in John chapter 9. In John 7 and 8, Jesus makes some pretty outlandish and outrageous comments about himself in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles. So they're in Jerusalem celebrating the feast, and the context of the feast is actually important for the understanding of the text. There were two important images that Jesus reinterprets, two images that went along with the annual celebration of this feast. The first image was the image of water, living water. Every day during the feast, there was a procession of priests who went down to a spring and drew up water into a golden pitcher, while the crowd surrounded them, chanting the words of Isaiah chapter 12, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." And this pitcher of water would be paraded from the southern part of the city and poured out onto the altar. On the last day of the feast, this procession took place 7 times. And in John chapter 7, verse 37, Jesus says, "Oh yeah, that's about me." He says, he stood up on the last day of the feast and said, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow within them." Whoever believes in me will have rivers of living water flowing within them. There was another image, though, that was closely associated with this feast, and that was the image of light. Another thing that would happen during the Feast of Tabernacles is that 16 large bowls were filled with oil. And they actually used as wicks, they used the undergarments for the priest's underwear, they used as wicks. And they would light these giant bowls during the night so that the light would literally go from the holy city into the surrounding darkness. And this was a rich and important symbol associated with the Feast of Tabernacles. And again, in John chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus says, "Oh yeah, that's also about me." In John 8:12, Jesus stands up on the feast and he says, "I am the light of the world. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." So now let's go back to John chapter 9. In John chapter 9, Jesus once again uses the light and the water to testify to his power. First of all, in the passage, he repeats that claim. You heard me read it a moment ago. He repeats that claim that he is the light of the world. But then, after saying that, he spits on the ground, mixing his saliva with the dirt, the living water literally coming from his own mouth. And he rubs it on the man's eyes, and then he goes and tells the man, "I want you to go wash yourself in this pool, the Pool of Siloam." Now, what you may not know is the spring of water that the priests drew this water from for the procession, that spring of water flowed into this pool. So Jesus tells the man to go and wash in that very pool, and when he comes out of the pool, he can see. When he comes out of the pool, his blindness has been healed. Darkness has been turned to light. And of course, that's where the story ends, right? Everyone was amazed. Everyone went home praising God. That's where the story ends. Of course not. There will always be those people, you need to understand this. There will always be those people who choose to see the blessings of God as a problem to solve instead of a reason to celebrate. A lot of times, those people are the most religious among us. And in John chapter 9, the Pharisees, they were more than up for the task. They were very happy to grab the whistle and to find any technicality, any violation to overrule what Jesus had done. And I feel a little bit bad for the guy that Jesus healed. I mean, think about this. You were born blind. You'd never been able to see, and all of a sudden you could see. Your darkness has been turned to light. What's the first thing that you would do? You would want to run around as long as you possibly could, just drinking in everything that you hadn't been able to see up to that point. That's what a dog looks like. You're kidding me. That's the color yellow. Amazing. That's a sunset that happens every day. That's crazy. But instead of doing that, he has to go to a meeting. The worst. As a person who spends most of my life in meetings, this is just a bummer. But he's hauled in front of the Pharisees to give an account of what happened, to explain to them how this came about. Two times they called this formerly blind man in to testify, because you see, the Pharisees had a problem. Jesus had committed a violation. He had performed this miracle on the Sabbath, and of course we couldn't allow that. And so they haul this man in front of the Pharisees and they ask him, tell us about the person that healed you. And the man responds very simply. He says, well, I believe he's a prophet. I mean, look what he was able to do. He's a prophet. After interrogating his parents for a moment, they call him back in front of them and they say, give glory to God by telling the truth. We know this man is a sinner. Now, you remember how this story began. The story began with the disciples asking whether the blind man was a sinner. And now he's asked the same question about Jesus. It's not really even a question. They're demanding that he just agree with them. You know he's a sinner, right? And here's what the man responds. He says, I don't know. I don't know if he's a sinner or not. All I know is I woke up this morning blind and now I can see. What are you going to do with that? They're not satisfied. They ask him, well, tell us, how then did he open his eyes? Now, I love this man. I love this man dearly because he is so sarcastic. He's one of the most sarcastic people in the entire Gospels. Listen to how he responds. I have told you already, and you didn't listen. It's like, I was blind, but y'all are deaf. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Delicious. They're rattled. They hurl insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. And the man answers by giving them a lesson in theology. He says, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could not do anything. The Pharisees had heard enough. They blew their whistle, and they rendered the judgment that Jesus had withheld. They say in verse 34, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. And now finally we get to my passage for the day. In John 9:35, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus says, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. The man had not just been healed of his physical blindness. The man had been cured of his spiritual blindness as well. And Jesus says in verse 39, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. For judgment I have come to this world. Now, the Gospel of John actually has quite a bit to say about judgment. But often what John says about judgment seems to contradict what Jesus says in this verse. In John 3, you know this passage, John 3:16 and 17, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And then verse 17, for God did not send his Son into the world, what? To condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Or John 8:15, just earlier in the previous chapter, in John 8:15, Jesus says, you judge, speaking to the religious leaders once again, you judge by human standards, I pass judgment on no one. Or later on in the Gospel of John, John chapter 12, verse 47, if anyone hears my words but does not keep them, I do not judge that person, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. So which one is it? Which one is it? Did Jesus come for judgment, or did he not? I think the answer to that question, actually, can be found back in that passage in John chapter 3. If we keep reading, context is important. If we keep reading in that same chapter, in verse 18, here's what it says. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. This is the verdict, it says. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Imagine a person hopelessly lost in a dark forest. After hours and hours of scouring the forest with spotlights, the search party finally finds him. Now, they didn't enter into the forest to condemn the man. They didn't enter into the forest to find him and say, "Ha, sucker." It's not what they did. They entered the forest to save the man. But their arrival, nevertheless, was a type of judgment. Their lights confront this man with a choice. Follow them and get out of the forest to safety, or choose to reject their salvation for the darkness of the forest. The choice is yours. Their arrival was not for condemnation, but it was a judgment. And it's true about Jesus as well. Jesus didn't come to condemn the world, but to save the world. But his coming was an act of judgment. Jesus is the judgment. Without judgment, there is no salvation. The light is come into the world, and we are left with a choice. So will it be the worship of the blind man who could now see, or will it be the rejection of the Pharisees who, even though they could see, they were nevertheless blind? The coming of Jesus confronts us with a choice. Now, I've noticed that there's an incoherence at the heart of our world, which is also at the heart of every individual, including each one of us. You see, we care deeply about justice and fairness, but we possess a reflexive resistance to judgment. In one breath, we demand that the wrongs of this world are righted, and in the next breath, we reject the judgment necessary to identify those wrongs. We're frustrated that we cannot see, but we resent the person who notices our blindness. In truth, we don't mind that judgment is happening. We really don't. As long as we are the ones who get to wear the whistle. As long as we are the ones who get to do the judging. Maybe we're more like the Pharisees than what we imagine. We're convinced that every other referee out there is blind, except for us. I struggled with writing the end of this sermon. The chapel team could testify to that. I showed up to the meeting yesterday and they asked me, what's our cue for walking out on the stage? And I said, I'll let you know in the morning when I've written it. I struggled with the ending of this sermon. An easy way to end the sermon would to simply say that the whistle belongs to Jesus and to Jesus alone. Unlike the Pharisees, the only thing to do is to surrender to his authority and surrender to his judgment. That would have been an easy way to end. The whistle of your life belongs to Jesus. And that's true. But it's also not entirely sufficient. Because Jesus he's not some referee officiating our lives, blowing the whistle when we step out of bounds, or awarding us with 2 points when we make a basket. Thinking about Jesus that way has the effect of putting ourselves at the center of everything that's happening and turning our relationship with Jesus into mere performance. No, Jesus isn't a referee. He's the light of the world. He's the living water, the bread of life. He's the authentic vine, the good shepherd. He's the Word made flesh. He's the I am before Abraham even was. He is my Lord and my God. And you don't just give him the whistle. You give him your entire life.